I read 12 books and 6 genres in September, which is a pretty big deal for me considering I've only read 30 books this year, meaning almost half of the books I read this entire year, I read in September. Let's get into it. Very rarely do I actually get to read as many books and as many genres as I have in just 1 month as I did this month. I don't think I've read this much since I was unemployed back in 2021 because I simply haven't had the time, so I'm so excited to discuss all the books I read. Let's get into them. I started the month with The Surrender Theory by Caitlin Conlon, which is a poetry anthology exploring grief and how you move on with life after grief. And I will say I loved the first 10 pages. It was a page turner. I was obsessed with it. However, after the 10 pages, I didn't enjoy it much. I don't know how best to explain why I didn't enjoy it. The first 10 pages, the first 10 poems felt to me really raw, really emotional, really deep. The first poem, I was sat in bed just sort of evaluating my life, and my friends FaceTimed me as I was staring at that poem, and I sort of just had to turn the camera and read the poem to them because I didn't know how else to best discuss this book. It was so beautiful. But then after those first 10 poems, it just sort of felt lazy. I don't know if you know the feeling that I mean. You know when you start reading something and you're like, whoa, this author put their entire heart and soul into the beginning of this, and it's probably likely that the beginning is what they edited the most. And then midway and then the end just felt like you were just filling the pages. Like you only really wanted to publish the first few poems and then you were just sort of filling the pages, and that's what it felt like for me with this anthology. So it was a little bit disappointing, but I will still give her flowers for those first few poems because they were beautiful poems. I'm gonna read you that first poem so you know what I mean in terms of the way it felt. There isn't much that scares me more than my own heart, a monster of tenderness. I have an irrational fear that I'll wake to find it perched at the foot of my bed, begging to be torn apart, consumed in the name of compassion. And that's incredibly terrifying for a few different reasons, but mainly because I do it. I've never needed an excuse to sacrifice myself for love. I am a martyr for everything soft. I confess to you I'd bleed for anything if it held me the right way. I confess I have. Whoa. Ouch. Painful. And then I'm just going to compare it to one of the last few poems in the book, just so you understand that difference in quality and emotion and feeling. The slice of fresh mozzarella you bring me from the kitchen in the middle of preparing our dinner crumbles on my tongue like a sigh of relief. In the quiet hours of our lives, you have reinvented love for me. Beautiful, tender, delicate. But I don't know if this is just me and my personal idea of it, but it just didn't give me that same raw human agony as the first few poems did. So that's why I think I gave it maybe a 3 stars, 2.5, 3. If I was feeling generous in the moment, 3.5. Next, I read the short story for Esme with Love Squalor by J.D. Salinger. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but this was recommended to me by, I don't know if you saw my last vlog of my birthday where I go and I speak to strangers and I ask them for advice. I met an American guy in a bookshop and we got to talking for a very, very long time, and he did send me the link to this book, to this short story, and he told me to read it because it was one of his favorite stories ever, and I did, and it was lovely, it was beautiful. I don't know how best to explain it. It's essentially a young man coming back from war, meets a young girl, much younger than him. It's not a romantic story, meets a young girl, and when they get to talking, she asks him, after finding out that he's an author, she asks him to write a story about her, but she asks him to make it involve squalor, to make it involve some type of deep yearning and deep pain. And I thought that the story was beautiful. I personally wouldn't categorize it as one of my favorite short stories. I would give it maybe a 3.5 stars. 4 stars maybe because of the way that he was able to bring in as much human emotion as he did in a 30-page short story, which I thought really involves a lot of talent. It really needs a lot of skill set as an author, a lot of talent as an author in order to do. But I wouldn't put it up there with one of my favorite short stories that I've ever read. It was definitely reflective and indicative of the author's talent, but I feel like I would need to read a lot more of his work for me to be able to relate to it as much as that person that I met did. On the topic of short stories, I then read What the Dead Know by Nevo, who is also the author of An Empress of Salt and Fortune, which is one of my favourite fantasy novellas in the world, and Nevo is such a talented author. This is a horror short story, and within the space of 30 pages, they were able to make me afraid and uncomfortable and feel unnerved just by reading this short story. Just with the first 5 pages, I was already scared, I was already unnerved, and it's essentially about these 2 travellers who basically make themselves ethnically ambiguous by not telling anyone where they're from ever, and no one's ever able to guess, and they travel to these predominantly white areas and they pretend to have seances where they speak to the dead, and in one instance, in the seance that they're doing in the story, they actually do end up communicating with the dead, and it is terrifying, but it is such a fun story, and I had the best time reading it. And again, like I say, it requires so much talent and such a skill set to be able to put an entire story, an entire world of emotions into 30 pages, but Nevo did that, and it was incredible. I then read You Deserve Each Other by Sarah Hoggle, which is a romantic comedy, and it was incredible. It has been maybe over a year since I've read a rom-com, and my friend Coco recommended this to me, and she told me that this would not only get me out of the reading slump that I had been in, but also would get me back into rom-com, because I was in the mood for something lighthearted and something easy to read right before I went on holiday and started reading all of my books on holiday, and this book was so fun. It's essentially about this couple that has been engaged for a while, but they're slowly low-key starting to hate each other, but no one wants to pull out of the wedding because whoever has to pull out the wedding has to pay for the wedding, so they just end up scheming on their own, basically making the other person hate them and trying to get the other person to pull out of the wedding so that they can't be the one that pulled out and that they don't have to pay for the wedding. This was so fun. It has been a while since I've actually laughed out loud reading a book, and I never expected that I would do that from just a rom-com rather than a purely comedic and satirical book, and it was so fun. I read it in a day and a half, which to some people isn't a quick time, but it is quick for me because I work full time and I sometimes just can't get into my head when I'm reading, but it was so fun. The romance as they rekindled it was so tender, so delicate. The way that the author incorporated jealousy and this being jealous of the other person and being jealous of the other people that person is seeing, despite the fact that you're still trying to pull out of this marriage, pull out of this engagement, is so beautiful. And the things that they are both willing to do for each other in order to try and make this work, like that neither one of them realized that they'd stopped trying to sabotage it until they figured that the other person hadn't stopped trying to sabotage it. And it was this issue of figuring out that miscommunication was their problem and figuring out how you can meet each other in the middle, how you can continue to keep learning more about each other and keep falling back in love with each other. And I think that that's one of my favorite things about love, because I do genuinely believe you don't just fall in love with someone and then just call it a day and you stay in love with them. I do believe that you have to make the conscious effort to continuously keep falling in love with that person, to continuously keep getting to know them, so you continue to love the version of themselves that they are. And people don't realize this because they're sold this idea of love as eternal, but it's not eternal, and you have to make an effort and you have to keep trying. And that's what they do in this book. They realize that maybe they just weren't trying hard enough to continue getting to know each other and continuing to love each other. And once they figured that out, they made that effort, and it was so beautiful. I then went back to short stories just because they're so easy for me to commute to and from work, and I read Persephone by Lev Grossman, which is essentially just a reimagining of Hades, Persephone, etc, 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 but I wasn't a fan. I don't really know what to say. This was 25 pages and it read way too much like this was for people below the ages of 15, which normally isn't an issue. I don't have an issue with YA. I love YA, but I just do feel like YA nowadays, or like some YA, doesn't have faith in its readers and doesn't put enough faith in its readers to be able to understand what's happening in the book, and they feel the need to consistently be spoon-feeding things to the readers. Wasn't a fan, didn't hit in the same way the other short stories that I'd been reading hit, so I gave it 2 stars. Then I read Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit by Jeanette Winterson, which is a lesbian lit fic set in the late 80s, and it is so funny, it is so beautiful. It's such a tender idea of the way in which you explore and discover your sexuality despite the evangelical household that the author was growing in. It's part fiction, part memoir, and she truly is a master of the genre, and it was incredible. What I loved so much about this story was, despite the fact that she grows up in a really conservative evangelical household, when she figured out her sexuality and when she figured out what it is that she was and what it is that she felt for other women, she didn't burrow herself into this little corner and just suffer. She didn't make the story a depressing, painful, tragic lesbian story like what we're always getting. You know, sometimes it's okay to just give us funny, light-hearted sapphic stories, and while it was difficult and she did deal with a lot of adversity, she never made that the core of her existence, and she never made that the core of who she was. And like I say, because it's part memoir, part fiction, mostly memoir, it was really beautiful to read how she was able to overcome that in the 80s, even in an evangelical UK household. It was truly beautiful, and the author is fantastic, and she says herself that she is exploring literary skill and she's exploring literary mediums, and she was trying a narrative that she hadn't tried before, and you can see that a lot in the book. You can see that in the way that she writes and in the way that she shifts the narrative and in the way that she's consistently oscillating back and forth in a non-linear narrative, to when she was a kid, to when she was an adult, to when she was a baby, to when she was a teenager, and just consistently back and forth, but then also back and forth between the fiction and the memoir. It was sometimes difficult to follow, but mostly really not that difficult to follow and really easy to read. And I never would have thought that like a short lit fic story like that would be a fun beach read to read on holiday, but it was, and it was great, and it was so easy to get through, and I really, really loved it, and I need someone to give Jeanette Winterson her flowers. Next is Funny Story by Emily Henry, which I devoured in 6 hours, and I stayed up until 2:45 a.m. to finish reading it, despite the fact that I had to be awake in 4 hours the next day to get to the airport. It was such a good book. I had so much fun with this. I was giggling, I was kicking my feet, I was having the best time in the world. The main character, Daphne, is dumped by her fiancé on his bachelor night because his girl best friend confessed her feelings to him after literally decades of being best friends with him. She decided that was the day to confess her feelings for him. So the girl best friend and him both leave their partners. He leaves Daphne and the girl leaves Miles, and Daphne is stuck having to move out of her apartment that she lived in with her fiance and move in with the girl's ex-boyfriend. So it's just this whole little weird incestuous circle, and they move in and they're both so miserable and they're both grieving this while they're watching their exes have the time of their lives, being together, dating, like being madly in love. And so one day on a drunken night, they decide to just pretend to date. And one thing I love about it is I'm not usually a fan of fake dating, just because I feel like the themes and the tropes are consistently the exact same thing over and over and over again. But what I loved so much about this was they didn't treat it as fake dating for the sake of, you know, just like with this really intense goal, and if we don't meet this goal, blah, blah, blah. They were having fun with it. They were just having fun fucking with their exes. They were having fun watching them spiral, seeing the way in which they were reacting to what they were doing and the fact that they were fake dating. And as they did it, they became friends. That's what it was. It wasn't that they fake dated and immediately fell in love. They became really good friends, and they started really enjoying each other's company, to the point where when Daphne decides that she wants to leave town, she wants to leave that city because the only reason she was in that city was because of her ex-fiance, Miles, her fake boyfriend / now one of her best friends, decides he wants to convince her to stay there by showing her all of the best parts of that world. And they create this big map, and they create this schedule of all the things that they're going to do together and how he's going to show her and he's going to get her to do all of this. And it's just, it was so beautiful. The romantic tension was fantastic. The friendship tension was amazing. There was very rarely any instances of miscommunication. It was very clear how they felt about each other. And it wasn't so much miscommunication as simply refusal to communicate, because neither one knew how to go about it. Neither one knew if it was too soon, but it was really incredible, and the humor was amazing, and the romance was amazing, and Miles is sexy as hell, so, you know, it doesn't kill to have that. Then I read Throne of the Crescent Moon by Saladin Ahmad, which is a Middle Eastern adult high fantasy following an old djinn hunter who wants to retire and a young apprentice who just follows him and acts as his assistant, basically being drawn into this much wider war and much wider battle within their country and their continent, and they have to defeat these jinns and these evil powers that are coming to rise. And I did post a review of this on my TikTok, but what I will say about it is I love the Middle Eastern setting. I love the way that the setting was written. I love the incorporation of mythology and of culture. I love the way that it felt like, as I read it, it felt like I was home, down to the sandy shores, to the cardamom tea, to you're stuck in the middle of this crisis, but you're walking down the street and you smell roasted peanuts and roasted chestnuts, and you decide to stop just so you can have some. You decide to share a cup of tea with your neighbor. I loved all of that. However, as I said in my TikTok review, I wasn't a fan of the pacing. I felt like the pacing was very slow, and it wasn't until we were maybe like this deep into the book that anything really climactic started happening. So I was disappointed by that, especially because it was advertised as an adult high fantasy, but it read a lot more like a young adult high fantasy, which isn't a problem, but I went into it expecting adult level fantasy and I didn't get that, so I was disappointed by that. So I did give it a 3.54 stars. Probably 4 is a bit generous just because I loved the setting and I loved the culture and I loved the mythological incorporation, but I wasn't a big fan of the plot pacing itself. Next, I read Kitchen by Banana Yoshimoto, which is a literary fiction collection of 2 short stories which I thought were absolutely incredible. The first one was Kitchen, which is a literary fiction exploration of grief and love and tenderness, as well as gender and sexuality and understanding trans identity without making it a big deal, while also dealing with grief, while also dealing with the struggles of grief and how to find love and how to find comfort and how to find friendship despite the difficulties of doing so, despite the difficulties of never quite communicating it. And I feel like it was beautiful. I really, really, really loved that story. Then the next story was Moonlight Shadow, I think. Yeah, Moonlight Shadow, and it was a little bit shorter, but again, it is also an exploration of grief, but this one is also done with an exploration and a touch of magical realism, which I felt like made the story a lot more touching and a lot more heartening and a lot more human. And it's essentially about dealing with this grief that you're exploring and how to find ways to let go of that grief and move on with life, and the different ways in which people grieve. For example, one person was grieving by wearing his girlfriend's clothes, and everyone kept on thinking this was his gender exploration and this was sexual exploration, but to him it was just the last thing he knew about her. And the way that the magical realism was incorporated was that they have this one moment that is a very rare, once in a lifetime opportunity, you'll never get it again, where they get to communicate with the people that passed, and in communicating so and in doing so, the people that passed away tell them to find a way to move on from this. And I thought that it was really, really beautiful, and the way that Banana Yoshimoto wrote it was extremely tender and extremely thoughtful, and I really, really appreciated it, and I thought that this book was incredible, and I read it in maybe 6 hours. Sticking to the lit fic vibe, I read If Beale Street Could Talk by James Baldwin, which, as ever with everything I have ever read by him, was heart-wrenchingly beautiful. The story is set in Harlem, and it follows Tish and Fonny, a couple who are madly in love with one another, but unfortunately Fonny has been wrongfully accused of raping someone and therefore wrongfully incarcerated, and Tish, 19 years old and pregnant with his child, takes it upon herself and the family take it upon themselves to try to do whatever it is that they can to free him, to bring justice to his name and prove that he has been wrongfully accused for the sole reason of being a black man in America. Now, as is the case with every story by James Baldwin, the story is not just about one thing. So while it explores this beautiful, unconditional, tender, raw human love, it is also a fantastically raw commentary on systematic racism and the injustices of the American system, particularly towards young black men from poorer backgrounds. So I'm going to comment on those two things. The love, I feel like, is written in a way that I had to swallow deeply every time I read it. I think there are some pages that have just been underlined from start to finish because Baldwin is such a talented writer. He's such an incredible writer, and that's why I have him tattooed on my arm, and that's why every time I see a video of him or a picture of him or an interview that has resurfaced or just anyone discussing Baldwin, I am open eyes, open ears, open mouth, open heart, because he is so talented. And the way that he writes this love, from the moment that Tish and Fonny meet as children to the moment that they decide that they are going to be together for the rest of their lives, and then to the moment where she is doing everything she can to bring the love of her life justice, it is just bang, 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 fantastic, beautiful commentary, beautiful love. The way that he writes it, particularly the fact that he is writing it from Tish's perspective, and I often don't like it when men write from a woman's perspective because I feel like they just can't do it. But he can, and I don't know what it is. Maybe it's because he was a gay man, and so perhaps he understood sort of the struggles that came with being a woman. Maybe, they come hand in hand sometimes, but he did it in such a way that the love and the romance and the delicacy of it, despite all of the adversities that they had to face, was beautiful. And then we go to this idea of he's been wrongfully accused of rape purely because they put him in a lineup. The woman that accused them was raped by a black man. And when they did the lineup of the suspects, Fonny was the only black man in the lineup, so he's the only one that she was going to point out, despite the fact that she couldn't really recognize him and she didn't know for sure if that was him. And they took that opportunity to incarcerate a random poor black man from Harlem. And the commentary of it and the way in which they discussed the way the system is treating him, the way the lawyers are treating him, the way the police officers are treating him, is just really nothing has changed. Could have been written yesterday. And you see that with the recent execution of Marcellus Williams, may he rest in peace, the unjust execution of Marcellus Williams. They just took the opportunity to incarcerate him because even if it wasn't him that did it, it's just another black man off the streets. And that's something I really love about James Baldwin and how timeless he is with his political commentaries and how timeless he is with the way in which he writes. So I loved this book and it was absolutely devastating and the ending was so unsatisfying, but that's the point. The endings almost always are unsatisfying in situations like this, but this book was a 5-star read and I loved every second of it. Oh, and then I read Scythe by Neil Shusterman. Is that how I pronounce it? I actually don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but oh my god, this book. I have never read an actual sci-fi novella. I've read short story sci-fis, I've read novellas of sci-fis, but I've never read a sci-fi novel, which is part of a wider series, and this book was incredible. Absolutely, utterly unputdownable, and I kind of hate myself for not reading it sooner, considering I had it in that pile of books over there for almost 2 years. So the book is a dystopic sci-fi fantasy novel, essentially years into the future when humans have conquered technology to the point where they've conquered death and they're basically immortal and death doesn't exist. But because of that, to deal with the rising populations and to deal with keeping people afraid and keeping people in check, scythes exist, and it is their job to glean people, which is essentially what we consider death now, because you can kill yourself as a human being here, but you're just going to be taken to a revival center and brought back to life, and the only way that you can die is if a scythe gleans you. But obviously, in this utopic world, in this utopia of life where everything is perfect and no one gets sick and no one dies, etc., 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 there are still going to be political issues. There are still going to be moral issues. There are still, you're a scythe, which means that you kill with no bias and you kill with no impunity and you do not kill for the sake of enjoying killing. Except you do sometimes, and that's human nature, and I think that this is a fantastic commentary of it. Citra and Rowan, the two main characters, are chosen by a scythe to be his apprentices, to become scythes, because he sees something in them that is compassionate and that is human, that he thinks would be fantastic qualities to have as a scythe, so that they do not glean and they do not kill with bias, and they do not do it because they enjoy it, but rather because they understand it is their duty to the world that they live in, and I think that that is beautiful. However, what they realize a little bit into their apprenticeship is that only one of them will pass this apprenticeship and only one of them will become a scythe, and the winner will have to glean the other. Plot twist! It's so fun. It's so exciting. I had the best time reading it. I've already ordered the sequel and I can't wait to see where it ends, but I think it was fantastic. The way the characters are written was incredible. The way that society was written was incredible. And one of the first annotations I make in this book is how effortlessly seamless the world building is incorporated into the narrative. It's just threaded into random sentences, random points. It's never, we have this system in place because of this. It's more so, this isn't going to happen because of the system. You know what I mean? And I feel like that is always the sign of a fantastic author. And I loved it. And I loved every second of it. And I thought it was incredibly good. Read the book. Also, something I loved about it was I didn't realize I was reading a YA book until my friend that recommended it to me told me it was YA. That's how well written it was. It read so maturely. It read so adult-like, which is why I miss like YA that was written back then, because YA was written back then, but it could cater to any type of reader. Oh my god, okay, I'm gonna stop talking about this book, but it was so good. And I read the completed and translated works of Sappho, the first OG lesbian. I'm not gonna lie guys, I was a bit disappointed. I mean, I don't know what I expected, because all we have of Sappho's works is just fragments, which means sometimes we just have lines from some of her manuscripts. And I will say, the fuller poems, beautiful, incredible. Some of the stuff that I have annotated, when we actually have at the very least a verse, fantastic, but most of this is just like random sentences. And again, it's my own fault for expecting more from recovered manuscripts, but I did just expect more, so that's my fault. I gave it 2.5 stars. If I'm just gonna go off the complete stuff that I liked, I would give it 4.5 stars. But just based off this entire collection, 2.5 stars. If I'm feeling generous, 3 stars. Finally, I forgot to mention, I did just start reading Vicious by V.E. Schwab. First of all, the cover is so pretty. This is one of those books, the reason I'm discussing it is because despite the fact that I'm only 30 pages in, it's one of those books where you know it's going to be a 5-star read within the first few chapters. And I know this is going to be a 5-star read within the first few chapters, so stay tuned for my October reading wrap-up, because I'm very excited for where this is gonna take me. Anyway, that is my September reading wrap-up. I hope you enjoyed this. If you read any of the books that I mentioned in this book, please let me know your thoughts, because I always like to know if people have different opinions to me or the same opinions as me, so I know how I'm thinking. Maybe it's the English student in me who misses just sitting in seminars and discussing books, but if you've already read some of these books and you do disagree with some of the things I've said, let me know.